It was spring, 1994, in Montreal. I was in my office when the phone rang. It was the Israeli consulate. My brother Ari had just been killed in a suicide bus bombing. He was 19 and a paratrooper in the Israeli army. The consulate reserved a seat for me on a flight to Tel Aviv. It was leaving in 4 hours, and I had to get to the airport right away. Upon landing in Tel Aviv, an army jeep came right up to the plane. Soldiers came on board. "Tali, we're here to take you to your parents' home." No customs, no security. I just walked down the stairs and got into the jeep. We began the 4-hour drive to the desert. I was numb. My mind wandered back to when I was 13. Another senseless murder. Another army jeep. That army jeep came out of nowhere, dust trailing behind. It pulled up to our home. I just knew it was something bad. The army officer jumped out and shouted, "Where is your father? Do you know the Bedouins?" "Yes, of course I know the Bedouins." He continued, "Last night, while out in the desert, one of the Bedouin children was murdered. We need you to identify the body." It was my friend, Awad. We had grown up together, riding camels, baking pita, and his family tent was really my second home. But now, Awad was gone. Awad's mother, Fraja, was in shock. She was such an amazing woman, so warm and kind. She had this twinkle in her eye. We were really close. And she would say to me, "Tali, ana bahebki," I love you. But now, she was so sad, and she seemed so small, sitting in her tent on the earth floor. I held her as she swayed back and forth, sobbing, "Awad, Awad." My thoughts brought me back to the present. Here I was, 15 years later, facing my brother Ari's death. We arrived at the kibbutz where my parents lived, and the first person I saw was Fraja. She had heard that I was coming. It was so surreal seeing her walk out from the dark desert night into the light of the kibbutz. I just lost it. I collapsed into her arms. We cried, and we held each other. I walked up to my parents' home. I couldn't believe Ari was gone. I had just seen him the summer before, and it was the first time in 10 years we were finally connecting. Before that, I had been estranged from my parents and, by association, my younger siblings. I found my mother in the living room. She was just sitting there, staring down, crying, not able to talk. She seemed so sad and so fragile, she reminded me of Fraja. I tried to hold her, but there was no response, so I just sat down. Everyone was in shock. There was so much crying and talking and deep sadness. Lots of people were coming and going, and the sound of the screen door flying open and slamming shut, and food. There was lots of food, but lots of anger too. People were saying things like, The army must strike back. The Palestinians should all be kicked out. Send them to Jordan. This is not their land. This land was given to us by God. A few days later, when my mother started to speak, she kept repeating, "The Palestinians killed Ari. They're the enemy. They don't want peace." I didn't see it that way. My best friend, Awad, was Palestinian, and so was his family. But so was the suicide bomber that killed my brother. I realized there was so much anger between both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. How did we get to this point? And how do we begin to diffuse the anger? I discovered the Montreal Dialogue Group, where Jews and Arabs got together every month to talk. Now, the first time I walked in, there was this person yelling at the top of his voice with lots of hand gestures. This was not what I was expecting from a dialogue group. But I did go back, and there was more arguing and more yelling. But there was also a framework to help us get back on track. And people were sharing personal stories, things like loss, suffering, and pain. And afterwards, there was food, always food, to help people come together, relax, mingle, and make plans to come back next month for, you may have guessed it, more arguing and more food. There was one person in the group that I got along with really well, Ehab. He was always respectful and very knowledgeable about both sides of the conflict. He was funny too. I felt this strong connection. We started dating, and 2 years later, we got married. But then, my mother found out. What? You married an Arab? A Palestinian activist yet? What were you thinking? What's wrong with you? She stopped speaking to me. How is this possible? I had been working on my communication skills for the past 2 years. Clearly, I needed better tools. Soon after, I came across the Compassionate Listening Project. Maybe this would help me reconnect with my mother. Compassionate listening is all about deep listening. Normally, in a conversation, we hear the other person, but we don't always listen. We're too busy thinking about how we're going to respond. Compassionate listening is taught through these specific exercises. We learn to listen from a place of empathy while putting our biases and judgments on the side. Why is that so important? Because at the end of the day, we all want to be understood. We all want to share our side of the story. And so, the hard part is not to get triggered when listening to someone we disagree with. We have this tendency to want to jump in and argue. In compassionate listening, we learn to recognize those triggers as soon as they start. We say to ourselves, this isn't about me at the moment. This is all about the speaker. What are they saying? What are they feeling? The listener actually stays neutral. We keep neutral facial expressions. We put all our focus on the speaker's feelings, not on our own. Now, that's the listener. What about the speaker? The speaker learns to get to the essence of their story instead of rehashing all the details. And when we get to the essence, things can begin to shift. We might discover something new about ourselves. We may even find answers to our own questions. I immersed myself in compassionate listening. I started my own dialogue group. The question was, what about my mother? Was I ready to try this with her? And would it even work? I had continued to call her once a month, and once a month she'd pick up and say very little. But I refused to give up, and I believe that's what Ari would have wanted. He had said to me, "Tali, I can see you want to bring the family back together to create shlom bayit, family peace." That was the last time I saw him. It was 6 years into my marriage. I felt the time was right, so I phoned up my mother and I said, "Mom, there's something I'd like to try with you. It's called compassionate listening." On the other end, "I promise to listen to anything you want to say. I won't interrupt, I won't argue." She was skeptical, but eventually she agreed. And that conversation, oh my goodness, it was tense. She unleashed all her anger. "I'm mad that you married an Arab and you disrespected Ari's memory." It was hard for me not to react. I clearly was triggered, but I maintained the course. And her anger turned to sadness and eventually a willingness to hear my side of the story. I felt such relief and such joy that finally my mother felt safe enough to have a relationship with me. After that, we phoned regularly. I visit her every year, and we now have a good relationship based on true dialogue. She even said to me once, "You know, Tali, you're the one person I can really talk to because I know you're just going to listen. I feel safe." She even started introducing me differently. Before it was, "This is Tali," and now, "This is Tali, my daughter, the peacemaker." I continue to use compassionate listening in my daily life, but it requires constant vigilance to keep the heart open, acknowledging the other, creating that space for the other person to open their heart and begin to acknowledge us in return. When we hit an impasse, relating compassionately can literally change the conversation. And it is this human connection that can indeed create meaningful change. Thank you.